Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. Welcome to the second day of the Global Policy Forum. I have the pleasure to start this opening with Staffan de Mistura. Ambassador de Mistura is a special envoy of the United Nations Secretary General for Western Sahara and has a long-standing experience as peace facilitator and mediator. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Well, the Global Policy Forum, of course, is mostly focused on the Ukraine war, inevitably, for all the repercussions, all the implications that the war have in many fields. Today, for instance, we will be talking about also the impact on the digital transformation, the impact in terms of refugees, of course, but also the impact in terms of SDGs and poverty and inequalities. But of course, there is a strong impact that the war can have also on other wars, which risks being overshadowed or even forgotten just because of the relevance of this war. So my question for you, Ambassador, is what is the international community supposed to do to prevent the other conflicts from turning into erupting volcanoes? Please.
Thank you, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's not the first time, it's a tradition, and as you probably can imagine, many years ago I was one of you students and hoping to get involved in international affairs and trying to learn from the experience of others. So let me do a little bit of a preparation on that. I will not talk about the issue I'm involved in, Western Sahara. for obvious reasons.
Okay.
No quotes, nothing, because I am in it, and I'm working hard with many others to try to find a formula which can be a positive formula. And I will refrain from going deeply or too deeply into the Ukrainian crisis. I know I'm disappointing you, but there again, the UN is, while we're talking, currently heavily involved, many of my colleagues, in trying to find some formulas to attenuate or limit the damage of this conflict, although I'm familiar with what is happening for obvious reasons.
Sure of it.
But that doesn't mean I cannot answer your question, of course. In fact, it does help. Let me make one point. Having been myself involved so far in 21 conflicts worldwide in the last 48 years, the first point is, sadly, you will discover, like I did, that surprisingly, world leaders in international affairs do have something very much in common. They do not have a great capacity of focusing on more than one issue per time. And that is a serious issue, but it is a reality. Even superpowers, by the way. Why? Well, because that's how their team works, that's how media works, that's how public opinion then works. So the result is we should be worried. We should be worried about those volcanoes, and there are many in the world. One could count, depending on the category of potential heating of the volcano, we could go from 40 to 80 countries, locations, places. Some are very sleepy, but it could explode. Others are ongoing or low intensity. So what is the next point? Well, the next point is that when the major conflict draws the attention of everyone on that one, then you have, as a result, the fact that there is a tendency of not wanting to get involved in the rest. And there is then a donor fatigue because the money, the attraction goes on the main conflict. Look at what's happening on Ukraine today. And secondly, there is even an exhaustion of interest by the international community. So what comes next? A danger. Why? Because while the cloud of the main focus is taking over and taking all the oxygen of the room, then that becomes a temptation, an opportunity for other leaders, groups, to be tempted to actually accelerate other conflicts, which have been sleeping for a while, because they're not on the radar screen anymore. That is a major danger. You want an example? Well, at the moment, just to be very far away, and yet potentially dangerous, the Secretary General raised it already several times, is the potential tensions on the borders between Rwanda and Congo at the moment. Far away, nobody notices it, but it's getting tense. And the potential, just to give you an example, very close to my own experience, the northern Syria issue, where there is strong rumors which then came like a volcano. Volcanoes produce rumors before exploding, where there is rumors about potential military activities, in spite of the fact that we had a period where we were hoping that at least that phase of the conflict would not be taking place. So that leads us to say, well, what can we do then? Since we are aware of the fact that when there is a major issue, especially, by the way, when it's dovetailing with another global issue. And the global issue before was COVID, as you know, and before that terrorism, and one after the other, and they all suck oxygen, and you don't have the time to recover, and then comes Ukraine. So when all this is happening, what can we do? Well, we can do something, and we should always, and by the way, you young people should be always feeling that you can and must do something. And that applies to all of us as well. One is to draw attention, because the problem is lack of light on it. No FARI, no radar screen. Keep attention on those conflicts. And how and who can do it? Well, since world leaders seem to be too busy, well, it is NGOs, media, ISPI, Crisis Group, Amnesty International, EU, journalists, so that we at least keep the radar and the light on it, so that there will not be at least the temptation to go far beyond that. And the second one is that there is always something that can be done in order to make those conflicts not exploding. Bottom line, volcanoes, very good example, by the way, can't be predicted. We can guess that they could have, but we will never be able to say when it actually happens. Whereas these political volcanoes are predictable. So the secret there, like in medicine, is prevention. Can be done, should be done, and can be done only when there is some attention on it. The alternative otherwise is that while we are all focusing, for instance, on Ukraine at the moment, we may see many other volcanoes coming up, and which will have an epidemical effect. Think about what happened to Syria. It started with nothing, or a local revolt, and it became a regional and even global.
Thank you so much for this. But when there are so many volcanoes, there is a risk, of course, that there are earthquakes everywhere.
Yes.
And this is actually the context, the international context we're living in, with confrontation, rivalries, wars taking center stage at the global level. So it's very easy in this situation to lose faith in diplomacy. You have a very long experience as a diplomat, as a peace facilitator, how to restore confidence, faith in diplomacy, even in a situation like today's situation.
First answer is, you're right. It is very tempting to be depressed, pessimistic, cynical about the role of diplomacy when you see so many conflicts, and some of them becoming so global in terms of repercussions all over. And secondly is to keep still believing in diplomacy. And I will try to convince you. I know it's not a good timing for convincing anyone about diplomacy, so you have to forgive me, but I chose it as a religion. And basically, I've seen in my own life that every time we were a little bit desperate, and we went through much worse times, I hope, than these ones, frankly, because we had the First World War. You were not there, I was not there, but it was a combination of First World War, 20 million people killed, and destruction all over the world, and in Europe in particular, plus Spaniola. Does it ring a bell, COVID? By the way, a little comment on what we were saying before. Have you noticed how this capacity of focusing is incredibly radical and therefore potentially damaging to other volcanoes? The day the conflict in Ukraine started, we didn't hear about COVID anymore. Don't you notice it? I even noticed it, but COVID had not just totally disappeared, because this monofocal aspect. That's why we needed to help the world leaders to have a multifocal lenses. And we can do it together by raising issues like ISPI is doing today, Bocconi is doing today in training. So let's go back to the point that you were raising. So there were bad times in the past. Yes, First World War, Second World War, then we had the Cold War. And paradoxically, Cold War, there is some nostalgia for it, paradoxically, but we have to. I remember part of my career was involved during the Cold War, and I was a young man, woman like you. We were starting our career, and the Security Council veto, mutual veto, proxy wars, Vietnam, Angola, Cuba crisis, and it was totally paralyzed the UN. And the question was, what on earth can the UN do? But there is always an entry point, if you really look for it. And in that case, the entry point was, well, true, the Cold War is blocking the Security Council, but there are areas where you can make a difference, where the two major blocks are not involved, NATO and Pact of Varsavia. And at the same time, the good news in the bad news is UN Security Council blocked, paralyzed, even more than today. At that time was a constant veto. But the good news is that you had only two players, US, NATO, Pact of Varsavia, Soviet Union. So when they got tired, or they felt that the proxy war was not useful anymore, or they found a way of finding some form of indirect agreement, they were able to tell both sides, stop it there, don't move. That is not happening today. I agree. That's why we should be concerned about it. But even then, we had an entry point. And the entry point was the international operational humanitarian diplomacy. In other words, you don't want to get a deal on peace. You don't want to talk about peace. You are still in the Cold War. But what about the hunger in Ethiopia? What about vaccinations in Central America? What about the possibility of having a lifeline in Sudan? How to find another way to make sure that we can be operational and remember one thing. The global world and politics will continue having their own stalemates. But for us, for you, the priority is we the people. Can we make a difference in the meanwhile? And now I'll give you an example. And that gets into Ukraine for a moment, but I will stop there, no more than that. When I think the Secretary General realized that, in fact, there was no movement on the Security Council, he went to Moscow and to Kiev, as you know. And I was not there, so I can't tell you what happened, and I would not go into details. But what came out afterwards was that he actually decided to follow exactly what I'm referring to, which we had during the Cold War, the humanitarian operational diplomacy, an entry point. And through that, hopefully create goodwill, or at least make a difference for some people. Mariupol, the evacuation of Mariupol, first the civilians, then the others. But it was not perfect, because, as you know, in these deals, nothing is totally perfect. But it did make a difference, particularly for the humanitarian side of the civilians. And now, while we are talking, that's why I stopped talking about it, is this attempt, which I think is totally legitimate and desperately needed, and which I know Italy with President Draghi is pushing for as well, is the possibility of unblocking grain and fertilizers from Ukraine, from Russia, so that at least while the war goes on, and it is terrible, not millions and millions of people who have nothing to do with this conflict will be suffering from. So bottom line, yes, diplomacy is at the moment in a difficult moment. But is this a reason to give up on it? At the end of the day, we will always go back to it in one form or the other. And while we're waiting, we can still make a difference.
Thank you very much for giving us hope, at least. And you were referring to the youth. And we, as ISPI and Bocconi, we run a program parallel to this event, which is the G20 Global Ambassadors. So if it's fine with you, I would take a question from a young participant. So there should be a young student here in the first row. Please stand up, introduce yourself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Abdullah. I'm one of the G20 Simulation Game Ambassadors. And I would like to thank you for your time and for the opportunity given me to ask you a question. We live actually in a deeply uncertain time, and the global youth has been struck by the pandemic, wars, and of course, climate change. But at the same time, you will find us, I'm included, at the front line of proposals, solutions to these challenges. What's your advice to us youngsters, to us students and youth from the world?
I have to breathe a little bit and think, because you are smart, and I'm getting prepared for the future life, and I should not just give you generic good news. So let's start by saying you're right in raising this question. Because if I were you, I would be concerned. And I would be looking for answers on how we can really, as a young people, believe that we can make a difference by preparing ourselves. There was, as I said before, plenty of occasions where younger people than you, or even myself at your age, did feel a feeling of despair or concern. But then we did see that we could make a difference in the way I just told you. And you know how? Also by doing prevention rather than curing. Some of you know that when I was, inspired by an incident that took place when I was just 18, which was in Cyprus, when I saw by a company, come apprendista, a delegation of the World Food Programme to Cyprus, and I saw a young man, a young boy, being shot by a sniper. And that produced a level of outrage that has kept me going, including now. I'm not supposed to, at my age, to continue working very hard in the field. But in fact, that outrage goes far beyond career. It is a way of believing that you can and should try, if you can, make a difference. Now, therefore I say, the first message to you is please, please, please don't despair. Don't feel cynical about it or skeptical, because the alternative is the jungle. And history has proven this type of cycle, down, down, and then up. Secondly, is that you can make a difference, especially in the prevention. And the prevention is by helping in one way or the other to avoid something to happen. I'm very proud, for instance, of a conflict that no one heard of. Why? Because it never took place. And it didn't take place, it's not on the news. You may find it on Google if you look the Mistura, Nepal, 2004. Because it was a conflict which had started between the guerrilla Maoists and the government, and then had 20,000 people killed. And both sides stopped for a while, but it was going to start again. And we were able, by using one element that I advise you to do, studying some elements of psychology, not just geopolitics. Because the people who are running the world and are taking decisions are not purely ideological. Think about it, look around, look at them. There is a need to analyze the psychological reason why that person, that man, that woman, they're mostly men at the moment, who have been taking that type of decision. Then you cover it up, of course, with geopolitics, nationalistic, even religious reasons. History has been like that, but particularly recently. So try to have a little course on psychology, and in fact I would advise Bocconi, if perhaps they already have it, to have a sort of psychology in geopolitics, because it will help you to understand and put yourself on the other side of the ground. And that will help us and help you to first understand why they're doing it, and secondly, how you can make a difference on that. Now, let me make a little appeal here. So, since you are students still, let me quote the Secretary General, and I will read it this time because I don't remember it by heart. He actually was present a few months ago to an opening opportunity in the US to a university. And he referred, and I liked it very much, to the talents, I talenti, which, by the way, was a Roman moneta, not by accident, because probably it was referred to the capacity of human beings to be good soldiers, good scientists, and so on, I talenti. And what about la parabola dei talenti, the parable of talenti? Two, It is, in other words, each of us, each of you, have been given by God, by your country, by your family, by your own capacities, the capacity and the potential of contributing to what, in fact, can be a better world, and give it back. That element, I think, is very important. To me, has been essential, has been the energy behind wanting to believe that you can make a difference and giving it back. So his message was to the students, and I'm trying to tell it to you, be useful, mindful, kind, bold, which doesn't mean arrogant, bold, kind, yes, but not weak, principled, follow those principles, don't give up on them. It will always be a temptation to make a compromise. Be generous with your talents. In other words, share them, use them, put them at the service not only of your own income, but also very much for others. And B, what business knows is always crucial, but diplomacy is normally in the old way not necessarily a quality. I believe it is a quality, it's a must. Be creative. And be ready to jump on opportunities, which is a combination of creativity. And the alternative is the law of jungle, and you know it. So the real issue is believing that you should try to dare to make a difference, which also means the capacity of failing. Therefore, my motto with you is, did you try? Did you fail? Try better and fail better, but don't give up. And use the privilege that you all have, because you have a privilege, like I had, like you had, to be in this country, to be in this university, to be interested and being equipped to make a difference, to actually do so.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I promise I will attend a course of psychology, but I'm pretty sure I will not be as successful as you as this facilitator. No. Thank you very much. And now we leave the floor to Maria Cuffaro for the first session today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And before I start, I'd like to, first of all, thank the university, Bocconi, and of course, ISPI for having this very, very interesting global forum. Now, I was listening to Staffan de Mistura, and he said that the day Ukraine war started, everybody forgot, that means us, the media. Nobody reported anymore on COVID-19. So we are here and we will start this part of the panel, starting from this pandemic, which isn't over, and probably has been the biggest challenge that this world has seen in the past century. Because it's more than a century that we haven't had, and we hadn't had to confront a pandemic, and of course, even a war. That's going back to the First World War. Now, the pandemic needed a global response. And in Europe, it came to the COVAX initiative. However, there are huge differences in the capacity of high, middle, and lower income countries to respond to this and other health emergencies which have not disappeared. And where are we in achieving the goal of good health and well-being for all? That will be the theme of this panel. Are we still on track to achieve SDGs, and what is the way forward? And you saw already the three persons with whom we will discuss soon, but first of all, I wanted to start with the chairman of Gavi. He has been many things in his life, but now he's the chairman of Gavi, and I'm talking of Jose Manuel Barroso. So, first of all, I wanted to thank him to be with us on the panel, and I would like to ask him, at Gavi, you have been co-leading COVAX, the Global Vaccine Alliance, which was meant to bring COVID-19 vaccines to lower-income countries. And at the height of the pandemic, I think everybody will remember that we started talking about vaccine nationalism. In the higher-income countries, for instance, here in Italy, everybody had free access to vaccines. It was not the same in Africa. Is it still so, and what is the impact on Gavi's mission? Mr. Barroso.
First of all, let me thank you for the invitation to participate in this very important conference. And I'd like to congratulate ISPI, Bocconi University, the OECD, and Think20 Indonesia for this very relevant initiative. You asked me about vaccine nationalism, what it is. What do we mean by vaccine nationalism? I would say it is the pursuit of vaccines in the national interest, very often to the detriment of other countries, including the buying up of all available supply and also the banning of exports of vaccines. To a degree, we can expect that. We understand that leaders of the countries tend to prioritize their own countries. But the fact is that in this pandemic, this was critically very strong and very negative and detrimental to the global efforts and detrimental to the most vulnerable in the world. Vaccine nationalism is not a new phenomenon. Vaccines for smallpox and polio were only available in developing countries after developed, richer countries had secured enough stocks for domestic needs. Now, how did it manifest during the pandemic? At the beginning of the COVID-19, wealthier countries placed orders with multiple pharmaceutical companies at prices others could not match. This led to the buildup of supply among a small number of countries, sufficient to vaccinate their populations several times over. Once vaccines were actually being manufactured, we saw export restrictions imposed, meaning that domestic demand had to be covered before doses could be delivered to international purchasers, like COVAX, the international facility. These restrictions significantly slowed supply of doses during 2021, leading to delays of several months before COVAX and others received their supplies. The effects were, of course, very negative because some countries found themselves at the back of the queue, and this has resulted in uneven vaccination rates we have today. Globally, 66% of the population in the world has received its first dose of COVID-19 vaccine, but this hides inequalities across the world. In high-income countries, 80% had already their first dose, but only 16% in low-income countries. As such, vaccine nationalism has in fact become a problem to the global response to COVID-19. It's still occurring, vaccine nationalism, but now I would say that we are in a better position. Let's be fair. Some of the countries that were stockpiling excessive quantities of vaccines and also making the export restrictions, namely countries that are rich countries, they are now contributing financially in a very generous way. And in fact, they were sharing the doses that they have excessively. So that's why we at COVAX, we have created the portfolio to buy those doses, but we had to adapt. And in fact, we were working with those countries, helping them afterwards distribute and donate doses that they have in excess. So we have changed our model, securing those donations from the countries that had an oversupply. And that, from that point of view, it was a success. But look, let's give an example. India, a big part of our portfolio were vaccines coming from India. But India imposed an export in April 2021. India, that has been historically a reliable supplier and with whom COVAX had 45% of its contracts with, of course, squeezed supply at a very difficult moment for the global community. So that was what I can say, the consequence of vaccination during the current pandemic.
Yeah, you've said first COVID, now we have got also the Ukraine crisis, which are delaying the progress towards what everybody would want to achieve, global health. What further international efforts, according to you, are needed to make progress in this field?
I think we should invest basically in three priorities. First, invest in future pandemic preparedness. Secondly, promoting universal health coverage. And thirdly, and not less important, to promote the idea globally that when it comes to global public goods like public health, we need a strong multilateral system. We need international cooperation. Let me go very briefly on each of these points. First of all, the future pandemic prevention, because the reality is that we were not prepared for this pandemic. It's a fact that some people have mentioned it before, but most countries, including the richer countries in the world, the most developed, strongest countries in the world, they had very, very bad results at the beginning. They were not prepared to deal with this pandemic. This should not happen next time, neither for those countries nor for the world as a whole. But if it's true that politics, at least at the beginning, failed, science succeeded. And it was a record in terms of the time it took to develop new kind of vaccines. Thanks also to international cooperation, some of those vaccines were the result of joint ventures, for instance, between American and European companies. This is remarkable, how important it is, international cooperation, including, by the way, the cooperation between the private sector. Most of these manufacturers were private entities, but sometimes with public funding. So my point is we should now give a priority to this pandemic preparedness, also at political level. And for instance, I can tell you, because I had the pleasure to be in contact with the Italian presidency of G20. I met Prime Minister Draghi in Rome, and I can testify how important he thinks this matter is, and also the very important legacy of the work in terms of the G20, that now the G20 presidency, Indonesia, some days ago I met also the Minister of Health of Indonesia, they are determined to continue. So let's use this wake-up call that was this terrible pandemic to show that we have learned the lessons and that now we are prepared institutionally, but also financially to address this issue. But it's more than pandemic. It's the problem of universal health. And as you know, we have the goal of universal health coverage. That is, in fact, a basic human right, and it was recognized as one of the most important sustainable development goals that was approved by the global community. So we have to promote it. And one of the major challenges to achieving this is the lack of healthcare infrastructure in many lower income countries. We saw that also during the pandemic now, when those that were finding more difficulties in responding to the pandemic were precisely those that were more vulnerable from the point of view of the pandemic. And many economies were simply unable to cope with the impact of COVID-19 because they don't have the minimum of healthcare system in place. So we need to help create stronger and more resilient health systems and strategies that not only improve future pandemic preparedness, but that set us back on the road to progressing on the very important goal of universal health coverage. This is key. But I also mentioned a very important political point. Today, we are in a more fragmented world. The global community is divided. And you mentioned the war in Ukraine. And I'm concerned with that because if I may give you my personal testimony, I remember in the G20 meetings, I participated in many summits from 2008, in fact, when we created the G20 summits until 2014. And at that time, in spite of all the differences, there was some level of cooperation and convergence. Today, I'm afraid that is not the same when we have basically the United States and Europe on one side, Russia, China on the other side. This is bad. So I'm not naive. I think we should not be naive. I'm afraid that these geopolitical divisions are going to continue and probably even intensify. But at least for global public goods like public health, or for instance, fight climate change, we have to recognize that the virus does not need visa to go from one country to the other. We need international cooperation. We need a multilateral approach. And so my appeal is that we do that with international organizations, with the World Health Organization, with other players like Gavi. Gavi is very active also in this field, and that we understand that what comes first is human dignity, and that we be able to encapsulate our divergences, political divergences that will continue, but to be able to cooperate when it comes to such a global public health, such a global public good as important as it is health.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Barroso. As you highlighted, I mean, the pandemic showed us that there are many important aspects that can be only solved through cooperation. And now I introduce you to our other three speakers. One doesn't almost need to be introduced here. President of Bocconi, Mario Monti, also, I mean, he's been, as you know, many things in his life. At the moment, he's president of Bocconi, chair of the Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development for the World Health Organization. Professor Monti, welcome to your university, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
And other speaker, Mohammed Edi Purnawan, he is the chairman of the Board of Supervisors, Central Bank of Indonesia, and co-chair T20 Indonesia. Dr. Purnawan, thank you for being with us. And Dr. Carlos Javier Regazzoni, joining us from Argentina, Director of Human Security and Global Health Committee and on the Council of Foreign Relations in Argentina. Doctor, welcome. Well, Barroso, he raised many issues. Now, I'd like to go into some of them, and I would start with Professor Monti. For almost 2 years now, you've been chairing World Health Organization effort to rethink health policy priorities in the light of a pandemic. And your commission has made several recommendations on policy priorities. What are the chances of their implementation in an international context with the Ukraine war still going on?
Thank you very much. President Barroso highlighted the nature of health as a global public good. And I will draw from that to say that within the proposals of the Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development, several of them are precisely based on how can we make sure that the international organization, the international setup, is able to deliver this global public good, which is public health. You ask very pertinently the question, but a breakdown of international cooperation like the one deriving from the war in Ukraine, how does that affect your proposals and many others? I'll give you two examples. One notable negative point of the setup existing nowadays in Europe, the whole of Europe, is the virtual separation between Western Europe and Eastern Europe as far as the surveillance on public health goals. WHO Europe, one of the 6 regions in which WHO is organized, is very broad. It encompasses from Portugal to Uzbekistan, from Finland to Turkey and Israel, and of course includes Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union. Now, one of our proposals was building on the obvious, namely, there is in the European Union a European network for disease control with headquarters in Sweden. Well, like they have one in the United States, for example. One of our proposals is that a pan-European network for disease control should be established, led by the WHO Regional Office for Europe, to provide rapid, effective responses to emerging threats by strengthening early warning systems, including epidemiological and laboratory capacity, and supporting the development of an interoperable health data network based on common standards developed by WHO, recognizing that governments will move at different speeds. So a sort of unification of the whole of the European region, not just the European Union, as regards this basic fundamental aspect of public health. And indeed, after the publication last September of our report, works were beginning on how to go about this. You can imagine what the consequences are as to the feasibility in the short term, at least, of this proposal, because one would have to put at the same table a representative from Russia, from the Ukraine, etc., etc. But so this is a breakdown of a potential cooperation in the area where the tension has been building. But let's go beyond that. Another of our proposals was much broader geographically. It was addressed to the G20, and the idea was to set up a global finance and health board, mirroring very much what the G20 itself had done for the stability in 2009, when another public good, financial stability, was broken down. With that financial stability board, financial stability has come back.
Professor, you're going into my second question. Sorry if I hold you up, because we have got a bit of a time issue, and I wanted everybody, the speakers, I've got 2 rounds of questions for all of you. I wanted to go now to the other side of the world. Let's go to Indonesia, to Dr. Purnavan. The concept of One Health brings together essentially human, animal, and environmental health. And do you think that countries are now really aware of this goal, and are they really working towards it? Dr. Purnavan?
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. About the One Health concept, as you already mentioned, is a collaborative, multi-sectoral and transdisciplinary approach at the local, regional, as well as national, and even global levels, with the substantial goals of achieving the optimum level of health services, health outcome, recognizing that there is an interconnection between the people, animals, plants, and the shared environment. Since the health of the people is closely connected to the health of animals, plants, and our shared environment, as well as the surroundings. The connection is now increasingly at a higher level today. Then we need the higher level of sophisticated system to respond it. And there are lots of factors now being changed recently in regards to the interaction between people, animals, plants, and the shared environment. Then the human population are growing and expanding into new geographic areas, as well as the result, more people live in a close contact with the wild and also local animals, both livestock and pets. Animal is very important in our lives for food, fiber, livelihoods, and travel, sport, even education or companionships, closer contact to us. They give us more opportunity for disease passing from animals to people. That is why we have to be very careful about this one. The Earth has been experiencing change on climate and also land use, for example, deforestation, intensive farming practices, and disruption in the environment condition and habitats, as well as biodiversity, would increase the probability for disease to pass between animals and people. Then the movement of people, animals, and animal products for business and economic activities has increased the international travel, trade, logistics, and hence it may spread a certain disease very rapidly across the borders and around the globe. That's why many countries, developing and developing countries, already gain recognition and aware and fighting these health issues at the human, animal, environment, plants interface, including last severe health issue on COVID-19. So the involvement of experts on human, animal, environmental health, as well as relevant disciplines and sectors from many countries in monitoring and also controlling, and also as well as evaluating the common enemy and health threat, and to comprehend on how the new disease spreading among people, animal, plants, as well as the environment is the world priority #1 for countries implementing the One Health. And in conclusion, for Indonesia to have the presidency of G20, and this is a new institution that is, I think, very credible to bring this health threat issue, especially in prevention and also preparedness and response, pandemic, as important as its strategy for achieving One Health as an ultimate goal to attain the optimum level of health outcome for people, animal, and environment is #1 priority now, should be in the board. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Purnaman, for stressing again, that this pandemic highlighted again that, we humans live in an environment and one has to sort of tackle the problem, from all its aspects, because otherwise, we can't solve it only with one aspect. Now I wanted to go to Latin America with Dr. Regazzoni, because COVID-19 forced Latin American countries to rethink their health systems and policies, and how to reconcile the need for healthcare reform and little space and high debt levels, which is actually your field. So tell us, this is a big challenge. How did you manage?
Thank you. You are asking me how to make the reform without the money. So first of all, in case Latin America commit to development, average lifespan should be 10 years longer. average boy should be 7 centimeters taller. Cancer survival should triple. Mortality from heart attack should be cut in half, and maternal and infant mortality should be history. To achieve these ideals, we need another economy. Impossible to get without healthier people. So we need health reform in order to have the money to make the health reform, in a sense. Without that, there is no development. Of course, as you imagine, the prospect of healthcare reform has been aggravated by the pandemic. The list of impediments is boring, and it is a nightmare. So we face an unfavorable scenario. Hence, we must innovate, be innovative, be scientific, and deeply rooted. And most of all, we have to be regionally cooperative. Regional and national health goals should be established and reviewed periodically so that they form the basis of health planning and accountability. Local scientific research is a critical component of reform to accelerate implementation, increase impact, and create a culture of leadership. In that sense, the last resolution of the World Trade Organization on vaccines is to be welcomed. New healthcare organizations are indispensable. We envision a network of redesigned organizations based on regional perspective, rooted in team building and scientific evidence, and strongly committed to technology diffusion, efficiency, community action, and impact. Local production of biotechnology is another priority. We have to focus on the medical technology that would be massive, efficient, cheap, easy to use, and cost-effective. Think that until now, medical technology frequently destroys budgets. In debt countries, too many times is a waste of money and are a privilege for the few. So the challenge is to rethink the problem of medical technology. Corruption must be controlled. Healthcare is one of the most corrupt areas in the world. Through technology, it must be controlled through technological systems. Without reform, fiscal space will continue to shrink and debt levels will stay rising. And this holds true not only for poor countries, but also for rich countries. So we all need a reform in healthcare. But for that to be accomplished, we need an ethics of ends. Human beings deserve to be treated as ends in themselves and not as mere instruments. I will cite the German philosopher Max Horkheimer, who said that there is a process of instrumentalization in the way that man and money are related, and we have to change that. The pandemic showed that nothing is more wasteful than disease. It is worth reflecting on the extent of the economic damage from millions of other currently neglected diseases. Facing the essential health reform in Latin America, it is first necessary to change mentality and then innovate with determination. Human being is an end in itself and not an instrument of the economy.
Well, thank you, because you stressed a very interesting and I suppose central point, because I mean, healthcare, I mean, especially in lower income countries, but not only, I mean, the problem that it should reach everybody, and corruption is one of the problems that has to be tackled. And I'm sure, I mean, even our listeners here in Italy do know what you mean. And I wanted to ask, I have to tell you all that Professor Monti, I mean, the many things that he is, I mean, he's also senator, so he couldn't stay with us because at 3 o'clock he's got, well, an important call at the Italian Senate, so he, of course, excuses himself, but couldn't stay longer. Dr. Regazzoni, I wanted to ask you, while COVID-19 has been main focus of efforts on global health, other concerns on public health have been relatively overlooked. Everybody has been focusing just on COVID. How can we capitalize on the response to COVID-19 for the forgotten and re-emerging diseases?
Good. The first way to capitalize the response to COVID is to learn its many lessons. And I will tell you a few. The first is that healthcare is better for people when it is free of charge. The second lesson is that it is better to prevent than to cure. The third, cooperation is everything. Vaccines are the best example. The same cooperation now treated by the confrontation between security issues and cross-border university research relationships. We face a world with less cooperation in knowledge, not with more cooperation. Fourth, the truth is hard, and many people will prefer a well-explained lie. So it is a responsibility for communicators too. 5, inequality matters. COVID showed that horrible truth. 6, COVID allowed us to understand that the state is once again the supreme entity. It was the only able to coordinate the management of the crisis. 7, for Latin America, it is also imperative to promote its biotechnological industry through innovation. If you don't promote local technological production, you are not going to have a good healthcare system. Lastly, hope is more the consequence of action than its cause. You first act and then you have hope. Because as the Brazilian philosopher Mangabeira said, the experience of the spectator favors fatalism, but the experience of the agent produces hope. So let's act.
And I'll cut you short on that, sorry, because we have got very few minutes, and I wanted to ask Dr. Purnavan to look, looking at the statistics on healthcare expenditure, and Dr. Ragazzoni made it very clear, what the problems and the challenges that are in front of us. The gap between rich and poor countries is really astounding. And this has, of course, consequences on the resilience of different healthcare systems, as we have heard before. What could G20 countries do to fill this gap, since you mentioned before that, Indonesia is hosting G20. So, please, Dr. Purnavan.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. I think about the G20 preparation for this matter to fill the gap is I think is very important. It relates to the outcome of the healthcare. The outcomes are our way of talking about the quality on the productivity, including the quality and fairness. The quality in healthcare has been the word that's the actual use of the word quality on productivity has created more problems, such as in a fairness and also in equality in healthcare, rather than the optimum solution, because the concept of the quality that has been used in the healthcare system has been really incorrect and widen the gap between the poor and the rich. Hence, the first thing we have to do is to get the clarity and also the focus on the core goal. If you focus on that goal, then you have to think and consider about number one, are we organized to deliver the healthcare internationally as well as nationally that maximize this value? And the second, are we measuring it so we actually know whether or not we are delivering it or not? And number three, have we managed payment system that are conformable to the extent on how we get paid to whether we deliver the value or not delivering the value? Number four is, have we thought about the healthcare system in a way that is aligned with this value, because the value is the ultimate goal that we have to be concerned of. Number 5, do we have the right services for the right location or regional? Number 6, are we doing the simple stuff in the academic medical center or in the university, and the complex stuff in the local community or local region or a certain small country in relation to the hospital services that really doesn't have the talent to do that?
Many points to think about, Dr. Purnavan. Sorry, but our time is up, and I do thank all of you very much, Dr. Purnavan and Dr. Ragazzoni, having been with us. Thank you, because there are lots of thinking points that you have given us. Thank you so much.
Okay, no worries. Thank you very much.
And now I leave the stage again to Antonio Villafranca, and we'll be back with the digital future or divide.
COVID-19 and then the Ukraine war. Of course, they are taking their toll on the economic prospects, the global economic prospects, and I'm very pleased and honored today to make a sort of health check on a global economy with the Nobel laureate. Here we are, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, professor at the Columbia University. Professor, it's an honor to have you with us. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Without further ado, I immediately leave the floor to you. Please, Professor.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. In the few minutes I have, let me talk about two major issues. The first represents a set of issues between the developed and the less developed countries. As we all know, we've just been going through a terrible pandemic. It is a triumph of modern science that we were able to so quickly detect the pathogen that was causing the disease and to develop the vaccine that could keep it under control. Those innovations, those scientific breakthroughs were based on a long history of publicly supported research, for instance, that led to the mRNA platform. Unfortunately, the public-private partnership that succeeded in bringing the vaccine to market and making the vaccine available to everybody in the advanced countries effectively broke down when it came to the developing countries. There was what has been called vaccine apartheid. It was a foolish kind of apartheid, a foolish kind of inequality, because while the disease continued to fester in any part of the world, it provided opportunities for mutations to develop a mutant that was more contagious, more deadly, more vaccine resistant. So it was in the interest of the advanced countries to make sure that everybody was quickly vaccinated. But unfortunately, the advanced countries put the interests of the big pharmaceutical companies above the interests of the world, and including those in the developing countries. They put profits over lives. 2 years ago, South Africa and India asked for a waiver of the intellectual property rights related to COVID-19. Eventually, we succeeded in persuading President Biden to support a vaccine waiver. We were disappointed that he didn't support a broader waiver, but at least he supported a vaccine waiver. But Germany, Switzerland, UK, and some other European countries resisted. They said profits are more important than lives. And in the WTO ministerial that was just held in Geneva, the trade ministers of the world again refused to adopt a COVID-19 intellectual property waiver. Again, putting profits over lives. If we can't get a global cooperation on something that is of such vital interest to all of us, is in our own self-interest, it makes me very worried about whether we can get global cooperation in other areas that are also vital, including climate change. This kind of inequity that we've just experienced has been manifest in many other aspects of the international architecture being discussed at the G20. One of the hopeful advances that was made in earlier G20 meetings was an agreement to enact a global minimum tax on multilateral corporations, multinational corporations. But as the expression goes, the devil is in the detail. And when the countries got together, the agenda, the discussion was dominated by the advanced countries. And the result of that was an agreement that benefited to a very little extent the developing countries. They had to forego their rights to digital taxation in return for getting more rights, but very circumscribed rights in other aspects of taxation of the multinationals. The whole framework was very unbalanced. Of course, now with the difficulty of getting that agreement enacted in the United States, the whole thing may be scuttled. So that's the first issue I wanted to raise, these inequities, even when reducing these inequities would be in the interest of the advanced countries, these inequities that seem to persist. The second issue is the new Cold War. The world is once again becoming divided. And the question is how we are going to manage within a rules-based system a more divided world. There's talk about friendshoring, there's talk about national defense, there's talk about restructuring the overall trade framework. It should be clear that the trade framework that has prevailed has not served our societies well. It was short-sighted, it didn't put enough attention to risk. There was excess dependence in Europe on Russian gas, clearly something I pointed out 15 years ago that was extraordinarily foolish, and now Europe is paying the price. But still, we need to cooperate. We live on one planet, and we need to cooperate not only in the area of trade, but most importantly in the area of climate change or dealing with the next pandemic, which will surely come along. And so one of the things that I hope the G20 and the T20 will discuss is how do we help develop a framework that will allow this kind of cooperation, even as the world becomes more divided between democracies and authoritarian regimes in the coming years. With those introductory remarks, open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. Really thanks a lot for this broad overview and also for recalling us how important is cooperation despite these troublesome times we're living in. Let me ask you something more specifically on economy, inevitably, Professor Stiglitz, with you. Because, I mean, raising inflation, raising interest rates, are we really running the risk that a financial crisis is just around the corner, wherever it comes from, whether it is a developing country or in Europe, of course, there are the usual suspects. I will not mention anybody, but you can guess it. So what's your view on this, please?
Well, let me make two remarks. First, this inflation is largely caused by supply side problems, bottlenecks in chip manufacturing, shortages of food, shortages of oil as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a whole range of supply shortages. And these will not be solved by raising interest rates. In fact, they may be made worse because what we need to alleviate supply side shortages is investment. And raising interest makes investment more expensive. So one of the worries is that as central banks raise interest rates and inflation doesn't respond, they'll continue to raise interest rates to the level that they'll bring on a recession. And then we will have the worst of all possible worlds, inflation with an economic downturn. That kind of a problem is particularly of concern in those developing countries, emerging markets, and as you point out, some developed countries where there is high levels of debt. We know what happened the last time interest rates were raised very rapidly at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. We had the Latin American debt crisis. The World Bank, the IMF, all expressed concern about a looming debt crisis as a result of the pandemic, and that was before interest rates started to increase. With the triple whammy of high oil prices, high food prices, and high interest rates, the chance of a debt crisis in a number of countries, I think, is one that one has to take extraordinarily seriously. Unfortunately, the debt structure today is much more complex than it was in the beginning of the 1980s, at the time of the Latin American debt crisis. Then the debt was held in relatively few hands, concentrated in a few multinational banks. Today, the private debt is held in many, many hands, hedge funds, institutional investors. We have multilateral, bilateral loans, and a major new player with about a quarter of all the debt, China. And getting all these together to help restructure the debt, something that will have to happen, and eventually did happen in Latin America, but after a very long time and a lot of suffering in Latin America, it will be even more difficult to design a restructuring of that debt. In 2015, the UN, partly as a result of a recommendation of a commission that I chaired in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, came forward strongly, almost unanimously, in support of an international framework for debt restructuring. But unfortunately, a few of the creditor countries, including the United States and the UK, opposed, and nothing was done. So here we have a moment with a potential debt crisis, a very likelihood of a debt crisis, at least in some countries, and no framework for dealing with it. One of the things I hope that the G20 will deal with going forward is the creation of such a framework.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. Now moving from economics to politics, so getting back to Ukraine. In March, you said that you agree with EU sanctions against Russia, but they were not enough, as Europe should stop buying Russian oil and gas as soon as possible. Now we're almost there. There is a partial embargo on oil imports from Russia. But do you really think that the European Union can get rid of oil and gas imports from Russia with no serious consequences and no serious impact, at least in the short to mid term?
Well, the first point, when I made those remarks several months ago, I was concerned that if Europe didn't break off its relationship with Russia, Russia would choose a timing to when it was most painful for Europe to impose a partial or total embargo on Europe. And that has, to some extent, happened. So it would be far better for Europe to choose the time of and the manner of its moving away from its dependence on oil and gas from Russia. The second thing is, I think this is a moment for massive expansion of green energy. To find fossil fuels, you have to drill, it takes time, but we know how to invest in green energy. We know how to invest in solar panels and wind, and we should have the capacity to expand that capacity relatively quickly. So I think this is a moment to make that kind of a commitment, which there has been a long-term commitment to move towards green. What we really need is a short-term commitment to move towards green very, very rapidly.
Thank you.
Finally, let me say that there should be more solidarity within the Western Alliance. And by West, I include countries like Japan and Australia, all the countries that are committed to democracy. This war against Russia is not just to protect Ukraine, but to protect democracy. We all have a stake in it. And because we all have a stake in it, we should all be bearing the economic cost. There should be a solidarity.
Sure.
So I think it would be a good thing if countries like the United States, where because we are neither an exporter nor an importer of oil, fossil fuels, if we made a contribution towards Europe to enable it to bear these costs better.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. Now, you kindly accepted to have a question from a student of our ISPI Bocconi G20 Global Ambassadors program. Please, introduce yourself, pose your question, please.
Hi, my name is Fabio. I'm one of the G20 Global Ambassadors at ISPI. Thanks a lot for giving this insightful speech and also for giving me the opportunity to ask the question. My question is, you once said that inequality is not a destiny, but a choice. How can we avoid that today's young people become adults in a more unequal world tomorrow? Thanks a lot.
Yeah. What I meant when I said, of course, that inequality is a choice is that there were policies that we could enact that would change the face of inequality in our society. And in some ways, President Biden has provided in the aftermath of the pandemic a good example in the bill that helped rescue the US economy from the pandemic. There were provisions to help poor children. And in 1 year, we reduced the poverty rate for children by almost 50%, from an unacceptable level of about 20% to a still unacceptable level of 10%. And of course, this poverty is not only undermines American economy today and our society, but it also weakens our future. So I think what we have to do is to think more deeply about what are the causes of inequality and what we can do about it. And just to give you two examples of things that I think could be done, or three examples of things that could be done easily. We need a more progressive tax system. I mentioned during my talk the fact multinational corporations, many of them owned by some of the richest people in the world, and companies like Apple and Amazon excel not only in bringing products to markets, but also in avoiding their fair share of taxes and putting the burden on the rest of society, even though they benefited enormously from the advances of technology that our governments have financed. But two other areas are, first, more equal educational opportunities. In many countries, those who are born of poor parents don't have the same access to education those born to more well-to-do parents. And more broadly, we have to, as I say, think comprehensively about the underlying sources of inequality and how to curb them. One of the sources of inequality is market power, monopoly power. Actually, monopoly power and market power are one of the sources of our current inflation. These firms have the power to raise prices well over their cost of production and to reap benefits even as the rest of our society pays an enormous cost. Increasing inequality now and inhibiting our ability to respond effectively to the Russian invasion. So it seems to me important for a whole variety of reasons that we have this kind of comprehensive attack against inequality.
Professor Stiglitz, unfortunately we have to stop here, but let me thank you sincerely, really, for your precious contribution to the Global Policy Forum. Wish you all the best. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I leave the floor again to Maria Cuffaro for next session.
Well, welcome back. As you see here, I mean, I don't think I have to present him. You should know him. He's the rector of this university, and I thank you very much. So this panel, we will discuss probably a key point to our contemporary life that regards the digital future. I mean, as you know, I haven't to tell you, of course, because I'm a boomer, you are not. Everything is done online now, even the war. As you know, I mean, cyber war is a big thing. But the digital transformation should be also the pillar of tomorrow's fair and sustainable prosperity worldwide. But however, the potential of digital technologies is increasingly scaled back by international disputes over the internet and over data governance. One example is Russia, that is making a closed data, but other countries are thinking about that. So there have been also what economists call black swans, COVID-19, and of course the war. How to find digital fragmentation and move towards a universal and affordable internet access, and how to strike a balance between digital sovereignty and data protection. So, Director Gianmario Verona, you already know, and there is no need to introduce him here. This is his house. And we are linked up with Maria Francesca Spatolizano, Secretary General's Acting Envoy at the UN on Technology at the United Nations. Thank you very much for being with us. You hear us? Yes, you do.
Yes, very well, thank you.
Wonderful. So I would like to start with you, Dr. Spatolizano. So diverging digital frameworks are increasingly adopted across the world. And the internet is growing more and more fragmented, as we said in the introduction. What are the risks that you see?
First of all, let me thank you all for the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to address this session at the Global Policy Forum. The risks of a fragmented internet are many, of course, and they go from governmental policies that restrict individual autonomy or even worse, violate human rights online, to actions by corporate actors that reflect their increasing dominance over the online space. And so the concept of an interoperable, open, free internet is increasingly under threat. Now, it's very difficult to measure, as you can imagine, but an NGO called Access Now has reported recently that 34 countries had recorded 182 cases of internet blocking by government in 2021 alone. So think how diffuse this practice is. And current global events, including, of course, the war in Ukraine, has only brought to the fore the divisions in the digital world that mirror, unfortunately, the divisions in the physical world. And we can, of course, see the open, free, and secure internet that we all would like to have as a new form of global public good. There are some who challenge the notion, but I think it's proven by the pandemic and how much of the activities we could not perform in person anymore were nevertheless maintained thanks to the technologies. So I think it's a fair statement to say it is a public good. But certainly, if not, if some do not agree, certainly they would agree that an open, free, and secure internet is a critical enabler of sustainable development and an invaluable means to empower humanity to continue to do what they want in this new media. But now, even if we agree philosophically on the need to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms online, in practice, as you mentioned, there are still very difficult balances to be struck between the many complex issues at the heart of internet fragmentation. In particular, think of the need to protect individual privacy in that it is often entangled, linked with the questions of access to information, or the need to address misinformation and harmful ideas online, which borders with the freedom of expression protection. So balancing the aspects of regulation and openness is clearly a challenge. In the end, it is about building, I would say, democratic societies, supporting accountability of institutions and private companies alike. Why do I say this? Because, and here I refer to some reflection in the UN, which really we all agreed on. Internet shutdowns, slowdowns, banning of particular applications interfere not only with free expression, but also they negatively impact the enjoyment of other rights like security, employment, education, health, as we have seen in previous panels, and political participation, including elections. You have seen how many interferences with elections in very advanced countries we have observed, unfortunately, in recent times. So indeed, keeping the internet on and expanding connectivity and affordability included in the concept for those on the other side of the digital divide are essential for sustainable development, for peace, and for human rights.
Well, yes, you addressed some key problems to the internet, I mean, especially regarding the free access and the differences between countries. I mean, being a journalist, I mean, for me, it's easy to say just, well, it's different in China, in Russia, than probably in Norway. And well, I wanted to ask you, that one of the UN strategies is to steer digital interdependence towards cooperation rather than confrontation. So at what point are we there?
Well, the United Nations Secretary General has long been concerned over the internet fragmentation and the growing trend towards different splinter nets. And some of you may be already well familiar with the efforts of the UN, which have accelerated, I would say, in recent years to promote global digital cooperation. I will mention here three recent actions. One is the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation that the Tech Envoy Office is now implementing with key concrete actions on universal connectivity, digital inclusion, digital human rights, and the Internet Governance Forum. Plus, all these are fundamental building blocks we are trying to develop towards an open and unfragmented internet. Second, we also work closely as the Office of the Tech Envoy with the other UN agencies and other partners. So it's not just for the UN, but it's a broader set of actors we want to engage. Governments, civil societies, technology companies, of course, so that we can build partnership and understandings in this area, which sometimes come from very different angles. And we, in these round tables we convene, we have a cross-regional and multi-stakeholder presence. And third, let me say, in his report called Our Common Agenda, which was issued last September, Secretary General Guterres has made a very important, a fundamental proposal to call for a global digital compact, which should materialize, so to speak, at the UN Summit of the Future to be held next year in September. And we at the UN see this global digital compact as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to bring together all the digital players, not just the government, but also civil society, private sector, other stakeholders, so to forge a new understanding and to agree on common principles for our digital futures. There are, as you mentioned, several different set of regulations. So we would like to bring together all the actors to agree on a set of common principles so that we have a framework which helps everybody to stay together, so to speak. And in fact, the report also explicitly calls out internet fragmentation as one of the key areas that the compact should address. Precisely in times like we are now, growing online division and fracture, the UN is working to build a consensus around this vision of a more open, free, secure, and unfragmented digital future. So looking ahead, we warmly welcome your contribution and engagement as we prepare for the digital compact. The Office of the Tech Envoy has recently launched, let me announce, an online platform on our website, and it is a public call for input on what should be the content of the compact. And I encourage each one of you to visit the platform, organize consultations around it, and provide us with your input. And any idea of cooperating and collaborating with the office is also welcome. At this point, it is important for me to recall here that the Secretary General has also recently appointed his new next envoy on technology, in the person of Mr. Amandi Ili, and he will take up his duties mid-July, so in less than a month, and I warmly welcome him, and I hope you will do as well. So in conclusion, if we are to build a brighter digital future for all, we cannot, as the topic of today's forum suggests, stand divided. We must emphasize multilateral and multi-stakeholder approach and cooperation, engaging us all in the pursuit based on shared values, such as those of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So instead of standing divided, we must stand united, because as the saying goes, united we stand, divided we fall.
Thank you, Dr. Spatorizano, especially because you highlighted, well, the key issues, and if it comes to this compact next year, well, that would be quite a revolution for the world, because, I mean, it is, of course, I can imagine how difficult it is to put at the same table all the different players. But now with Professor Verona, I would like to go a bit more in depth. So besides the regulations, what tools can Europe envisage to narrow its technological divide? Because here in Europe, so let's talk about us, because we do have a technological divide versus China, versus the US.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And let me say that this is a very complicated question with a very simple answer, which is innovation. So we have to innovate more. And let me get to a motivation of this simple answer. Essentially, digital technology is what economists call a general purpose technology. It is a type of technology which serves the purposes of many other technologies and many other sectors. So essentially, it's not just about the digital, but it's about how we live. It's about how we communicate, as we have seen over the pandemic. It's about producing new drugs. It's about listening to music. It's about everything. And the history of humankind tells us that there have been at least two other general purpose technology, which is the steam engine back in the 1700s and the electricity back in the 1900s. And this general purpose technology bring into life a sort of revolution, which we called in modern times industrial revolution. So I believe that, I wouldn't say a mistake, but probably a disattention of Europe in the last 25 years has been to not consider this technology as the engine of an industrial revolution. Now, even like it happened with the case of electricity and what is happening in these days in digital technology, there are markets that are more keen to innovate. And so the United States has been the pioneer in introducing many innovations back in the 20th century. And it has been, the country that has created most of the innovation in this field. In fact, today we talk about the big tech. We talk about this new acronym like FANGM, so Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, and so on and so forth. Now, they could do that because the structure of markets in the United States is very liberal, is very much an intertwine between financial sector and real economy. Now, what China did was something very interesting, because basically China, back at the beginning of the millennium, understood the fact that this was an industrial revolution and decided, of course, China is not Europe, I would say also fortunately, and decided to stop what is going on in China with respect to these digital innovations. And they created their own capabilities in terms of innovation scale. And so they saw Amazon, and they, of course, produced differently with their own creativity. Alibaba, they have seen, Google, and they have done Baidu, and so on and so forth. So they invested a lot of money in innovating and in transforming their own industries. And I guess that this has been very wise from the Republic of China. Now, what Europe did, Europe is a big market, right? It's 450 million users of this technology. We fell in love, like everyone falls in love with this type of technology. We have an entire new generation, which is called Gen Z or millennials, right? All these people that were born, after the late 90s and Gen Z after 2000 that really are into this technology. Many of our students here, for example. And so we have been a wonderful market, but with limited supply. We have some cases of ventures in Europe. I'm thinking about Spotify, for example, which is an important venture in Sweden, or Yux, for example, in Italy. Federico Marchetti, by the way, Bocconi alumnus, created Yux, that is, of course, a leading company in the fashion market, in the digital technology. But Europe has been lagging behind a little bit in this innovation game, which, again, is crucial in these years. Now, the positive angle, which I personally see in these days, is the Next Generation EU Fund. Because finally, Europe, probably because also of the pandemic, and seeing how much we have used the technology with the smart working, with remote teaching, and so on and so forth, has decided to dedicate most of the funds to, of course, the sustainability challenges that are crucial for Europe to survive, but also to digital technology. And I really hope that this intention to innovate will, of course, go beyond also in the next years, the Next Generation EU Fund. In Italy, for example, we have this PNRR, which is a crucial plan of the Next Generation EU Fund that will bring us a lot of attention in this. But I really hope that also bankers in Europe, in general, most of politicians understand that it's crucial really to stimulate with incentives across states this need of innovation.
Well, that's crucial, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, just think of the whole of Europe, the whole of Italy could be connected and have access to internet. It would be quite a hell of a difference. Now, overcoming the digital divide is both an educational, and that's your field, and a cultural challenge as well. How can higher education, as Bocconi University and other institutions, contribute towards that?
Now, this is another very important point, because as you notice, this is clearly a cultural challenge. There is also an infrastructure challenge, which is, of course, the premise in order to then win the cultural challenge. And again, I believe that infrastructure-wise, again, also thinking what Dr. Spatorizano was saying before, we are trying to do much better. And again, going back to the Next Generation EU Fund, most of these funds, technologically wise, are invested really to make the divide smaller from this infrastructure viewpoint. So I'm seeing, for example, in the case of Italy, the south closer to the north, the peripheries of big cities closer to the cities. But then once we have also the infrastructure, it's a matter of winning the cultural challenge. And again, this is big, because we are changing the ways also, again, we work, we behave, and we have to get used to these new waves. We have to have this taste for innovation, let me put it this way, in order to really embrace this cultural challenge. Now, the paradox of this technology is that on the one hand, it poses the challenge, but at the same time also it has in its own DNA the solution, because basically this is an open technology, right? It's a technology which is in most cases free, and so we can access, for example, the knowledge related to this type of technology. And I see at least three mechanisms that are in place already in these years. First of all, the big tech are providing a lot of, for example, of courses for people to familiarize and to become alphabetized with this type of technology. And they are also producing certificates with respect to this. And this is very important also for the workforce. Now, in these years of greater resignation, as they call it in the United States, part of this depends upon also the fact that you don't feel apt to run specific jobs because you are not a data scientist, for example. So this first mechanism in place is very important. Then there are a lot of new operators, new startups, that again, unfortunately, come primarily from US and China that are into education. And so I'm thinking about big names in the market like edX or Coursera, which are providing many courses in this respect. But the third mechanism, which I personally like a lot, is what universities can do. So I personally believe that incumbents of education industry, education sectors, have to really support this transformational period in order to provide, again, the mechanisms for all the students, and not simply in their own country, but in the whole entire world, to access this. And so there are many initiatives that can be done. And so just as a small example of my institution, which is, by the way, imitating what, for example, Wharton University, the Wharton UPenn University with the Wharton is doing in the United States. We have written in the 2025 strategic plan that we will launch a bachelor degree for developing countries, which will be entirely online. And this is something very important because this provides access to people that cannot afford traveling, that cannot afford the beautiful, of course, on-campus experience, which many universities can provide to their own students. So again, the positive angle is that there is a challenge, but at the same time, like it happened in your sector, for example, in the media industry, in the news industry, internets tend to commoditize most of the things. And so access is also simple. So it's important, the regulation, it's important to provide everyone the access, but I believe that the future will go more and more in this direction.
Well, sure is. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, because, I mean, of course, even in our field, life changed completely with when everything went online. So, I mean, in a good, and it poses many challenges as well that we have to take. We can't just not ignore them. Professor, thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Spatolisano, for being with us. Now I want to introduce the next speakers of the panel, and again, we'll bring you around the world. We start with Indonesia, with Dr. Venkatachalam Ambumosi. He's Director of the Research Strategy and Innovation of ERIA and co-chair T20 Indonesia. Thank you for being with us. And Claudia Costin, Director of the Center for Excellence and Innovation in Educational Policies, Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and Jane Horvath, who is here with us in person, and I ask her to come on stage. Thank you so much. Senior Director of Global Privacy, Apple. Thank you so much. I know that Dr. Costin, she has got a plane to catch. So if the other speakers don't mind, I'll first pose the questions and then we free her because she has to catch that plane and we don't want to delay her. So I wanted to start asking you that about the broader use of technology will inevitably increase the need for digital technology-related skills, as we heard from Director Verona. Are education systems able to meet these needs?
Okay, so first, thank you for the kind invitation from the organizers. And no, they are not evenly organized to address these needs. Unfortunately, although there has been a huge expansion in connectivity and access to the digital content, it is unevenly distributed among regions and within countries. And the education system very early on needs to address these needs. And COVID had made it really clear with schools closures and the difficulty to reach the students that were in rural areas. Some countries, like my own in Brazil and some other countries in Latin America, for example, were 2 full school years with their schools closed, completely closed. So if connectivity was not available, it was an issue. But as you mentioned in your question, digital skills also need to be available for teachers. And yes, they were already using the internet in many countries before that, but not for teaching purposes. And they had very quickly in crash digital courses to learn how to do it. And it is very important that we not only provide the connectivity that was lacking, but that we provide teachers with the skills that they developed in a very unorganized way. And so in technology is important for building human capabilities, and UNESCO, a recent UNESCO document mentioned it is also a basic human right, the access to connectivity and to digital skills. So we have to ensure that they are used, including to rebuild the losses, the learning losses that happen in K-12 education and also in university students. Students are coming to the university much less prepared after these school closures that were also uneven, and technology might be a response. But there is another side to that I will, in my final comment to your question, mention, that since AI and an accelerated automation is replacing human work, is killing jobs. Yes, other jobs will be created in this digital revolution, but it is, for the time being, replacing human skills. It is very important to provide young students not only with digital competences, but the competences needed to thrive in this new era, such as critical thinking, collaborative problem-solving skills with creativity, other skills that complement the digital skills. Otherwise, teachers will be replaced by computers and people will be replaced by algorithms. And definitely that's not what we want for the world.
No, that's rather dystopic. I mean, to think that computers can replace teachers and persons. But I wanted to ask you, before we let you go, I mean, of course, access to digitalization and to the net is important, and also the know-how. But then there comes also another division, a gender division, because only 18% of tertiary education are girls that pursue the so-called STEM studies, that means science, technology, engineering and maths, compared to 35% of boys. How does that impact, and how can one address this inequality?
Well, first, a quick comment on the dystopia. It is not a dystopia, it's not that computers will substitute people in general, but inequalities will widen, will be deepened in a sense, because some people will have their jobs replaced by computers, some no, but unfortunately those less prepared, especially in the developing countries, will be the ones that will see their jobs disappear. On the gender division, it's very important to take practical approaches in education policies. For example, bringing role models to schools, not to universities, starting very early on, bringing scientists to talk to the girls, also reserving some time, booking some time and space for exposing young students to different career paths and work possibilities, and fighting those stigmatized approaches to careers such as science, technology, engineering are for boys, not for girls. And in a context where the world of work is changing so rapidly, it's very important to teach them that they are the entrepreneurs of their own future lives. I mean, students from K-12, it's not starting with university, and showing them that they can aim high, and that the girls have a vast field of possibilities open to them. And last but not least, showing them that they can interview women scientists and think of life plans that they will be able to build, and that environment will be very receptive for women.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you are in time to catch your flight. Thank you, because that's especially the aspect of gender equality, and to make it possible for women, for girls to have access and have a safe future afterwards. That is really very, very important. Now, I think that the biggest question of all regarding the digital world, I would like to pose to Jane Horvath here from Apple. And in the past few years, tracking, we're talking about privacy, so you all know what we mean. Tracking has become ubiquitous. As a result, consumers have become increasingly concerned, especially here in Europe, and we do have different laws than the US, as you know, about their data being used in unexpected ways, either by the companies or by governments or external powers. So in your view, is the consumer tech industry doing really enough?
So first, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to talk today, and you have hit the nail on the head. Over, particularly the pandemic, but in the last 10 years, as our lives have become more and more digitized, it's really, really important that we get the privacy equation correct. I will say that at Apple, privacy is a fundamental human right. I've been at Apple for 10 years. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer at Apple, spend 100% of my time focused on building privacy, along with a robust cross-functional team at Apple, including support and commitment from our Chief Executive Officer. So the advertising question is a really good one, and probably best illustrated in telling the story about advertising in our ecosystem. So 11 years ago, when I started at Apple, there was advertising on the platform. Apps were using what was a hardware identifier to target ads on the platform. So hardware identifier is a identifier kind of like a serial number on your device, can't be changed, and they were using it to share data across apps. And we realized that that was actually not a privacy-friendly way, because you can't reset it. It travels with your device, and users had no choice. They were getting targeted, their data was getting shared. So we launched a new advertising platform, recognizing that advertising plays a pretty critical role in the ecosystem. And that new technology focused on giving our customers choice over what was happening with their data. And we rapidly realized, it was an opt-out choice, that the data arms race was continuing. So my team also gets a lot of customer questions into our privacy queue. And one of the questions that was resonating, and there's more forms of this, but I'll give you an example. I was talking to my husband the other day about a shoe that I'd like him to give me for a holiday present. And suddenly, that shoe is following me all over my device. Is my phone listening to me? And in fact, no, your phone is not listening to you. Probably she looked at the shoe on an app, and that app then shared the fact that she was looking and interested in a shoe with third-party advertising networks. And those third-party advertising networks were placing shoe ads to get her attention. Hey, please buy this shoe, everywhere she went. And so in response to that, we realized that we needed to do something different, and we needed to put our customer at the center of this. They were obviously not understanding what was going on with their data. So 2 years ago, we flipped the choice. The choice is now, and we announced it, we gave apps 9 months to prepare, but the apps now, if they want to track you, meaning if they want to share your data with third parties or link third-party data, they now have to ask you. They have to make a case for the value proposition. So that puts the consumer at the center of things. And I think the conversation has been, you know, you can't have great products and services and still have privacy, but we really reject that. And I think it's very, very critically important as we move further and further into the digital future that we get it right.
Well, sure. I think we could stay hours talking about this, because I do think that privacy on the net is crucial, because yes, of course, I also have an iPhone. It's better than the others. But there are, of course, issues, because it's not Apple. It is the system that has many critical issues, especially on data sharing. Who is controlling them, what the companies do, but it will take hours. I want to go now to Indonesia, to Dr. Ambu Mozi, and I'd like to ask you how to leverage digital transformation for a stronger and smarter world economical recovery, because the whole world is should recover after 2 years of pandemic, where digitalization has been key, but has also shown a big divide.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for having this panel. Here, if you look from the perspective of developing and emerging economies, the COVID has pushed the digitalization everywhere. And so many countries felt that is placing the digital as the core of the recovery is a good strategy, because this strategy includes basically a cost-effective way, bringing these kind of a new transformational elements in the industries. Aside from the economic benefits, going digital also offering the emerging economies lifestyle work changes. For example, we calculated the ASEAN Smart Cities, a network of 29 cities. By bringing this digital technologies, a combination of the digital technologies, we could be able to reduce the carbon emissions by 20 to 30%. And also, we have proven that is during this pandemic lockdown period, nearly 50% of the FDI is coming into that digital infrastructure rather than the original conventional structure. It has been proven that is the returns from this digital infrastructure improvement has been 70% more than the normal one. And also, this returns also varies from the industries. And for example, asset-heavy industries in this region, and for example, in Indonesia, realize more value from automation, like robotics. And then asset-light industries realize a greater value from the mobile and the social media, primarily driven by these efficiency-driven opportunities. So this is a kind of a hard reality we witnessed during this pandemic. And if you see that pandemic, we can see there is a 4 stages of digitalization. One is the rebound phase that happened in the initial 3 months period, where the temporal changes has been observed in these technologies. And the second stage is the next 6 months is more about the substitution, which is more related to the permanent or the semi-permanent changes in the consumer goods and the services. And the third stage is, it happened during the recovery, is a process where there is a working style has been changed, and it also revolutionized some of these industries.
Well, thank you.
Oh,
sorry.
If you look into this, these are basically characterized that is consistent with the whole world, and particularly the developing and the emerging economies are moving into a smart economy, which has been enabled by the combination of the technologies. But one thing is very, very vivid, this digital divide, the gaps between the haves and have-nots. For example, if you take the small and medium enterprises in Germany, they have most of them have about 87% of them have the high-speed internet. But if you come into the Indonesia, it is only 20%. This digital divide also exists between the urban areas and the rural areas. So more investment is needed from the private sector, and also the regulations are required.
Well, that's really very important, Dr. Ambomosi, because of course, I mean, in the higher income countries, I mean, even small enterprises have access to fiber, to fast data exchange, whereas in many countries, for instance, in Asia or in Africa, it's more difficult if you are in a rural area. That's also where many people live. But now back to privacy, because that's the core, I suppose. So different data privacy laws, I've mentioned that in the beginning, across countries means also different kind of protection rights for internet users. I mean, typically Europe, US, or other side of the world, China. How to avoid a division into first-class and second-class citizens?
It's a great question, and I think that the most interesting part of your question is you said Europe and the US. Europe has an omnibus privacy law. It has GDPR, and GDPR has really set the standard across the world. It's led, in particular in our company, we've committed to GDPR user rights across the world, but the United States, interestingly enough, does not have an omnibus privacy law. There are some states in which they've passed an omnibus law, similar to GDPR, so there's actually not even protection across the US. And then if you start to look out across the globe, there are countries that have passed privacy laws that are actually data localization laws. There are countries who say, okay, we're going to pass a privacy law, but it's really a surveillance law. They've realized if the data is in their country, they can get access to it. So they pass a data localization law. So there is a patchwork of laws right now. And then we also have to look at government access to data. And I think that there needs to be a common framework on both consumer privacy and government access to data. And a shout out to the OECD, because they are currently working on the framework with respect to government access. But you know, I think it's high time that all citizens have a common level of protection so they can take control of their data.
Well, that would be really, let's say, the day, because I mean, at the moment we seem rather far away from that. And I wanted to again go to Indonesia, to Dr. Ambomosi, because you are also you are the co-chair at the T20 task force on meaningful digital connectivity and cybersecurity empowerment. So what are the preliminary policy recommendations in this task force, Doctor?
Here, our task force, basically, we believe that is the digital transformation provides the opportunities for both the advanced and the developing economies to leapfrog this industrial age infrastructure, to draw on the vast knowledge spillovers from the internet, and to take advantage of the new market offered by the digital platforms, and to exploit these production possibilities enabled by the digital technologies. From that standpoint of view, and there are 5 policy recommendations that made it. We communicated. We are in the process of communicating to the G20. The first one is the place the digital at the core of the recovery strategy, and investing in the digital generates the greater than the average returns for the economy, particularly for the G20s. Second is the boost the infrastructure investment, and the foundation for the digital economy is strong, and it needs a reliable infrastructure. And the third one is that enabling a digital recovery for all, not just for the few. And the fourth one is pushing the green and the digital agenda together, and because we found a lot of synergies and the complementarities, and as well as the multiplicity of the co-benefits. And the fifth one is that is more important, and which is the double the efforts to improve the ICT skills and the digital literacy. And for the data governance architecture, we recommend to establish a fair digital competition, basically to promote the technology neutrality and then encourage the collaboration between the advanced and the emerging economies. I think these are the 6 major issues of recommendations that is being made to the G20.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ambomosi, and thank you as well. It would need another session if we would want to go to the privacy issues. But now I'm happy to leave the stage to Paolo Magri from ISPI, that will have the conversation with Filippo Grandi of the UNCR, head of the UNCR, and Carolina Sanchez Paramo. And see you very soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not Paolo Magri. Paolo will be with us anytime soon. But let me start this session on refugees. We titled this session Refugees in an Unfair World. Yesterday, President Zelensky reminded us that 12 million people have already fled their homes. And there are also millions of refugees all around the world and moving very often to neighboring countries, which are developing countries, poor countries. So in a context of increasing inequalities and poverty. That's why we titled this session, Refugees in an Unfair World. And I have the pleasure to start this session with the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, Filippo Grandi. So my first question to Mr. Grandi is what are the far-reaching consequences of the unprecedented humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, and what are the specific consequences for the European Union? Please, Mr. Grandi.
Thank you very much. First of all, I am very honored to participate in this global policy forum. I'm very, very sorry that I cannot be in person with you as I would have liked, but glad that I can contribute to this very important debate. And the question of the Ukrainian forced displacement movement has so many ramifications. The question is extremely important. First and foremost, I think the question applies to Ukraine. This is the largest exodus of people, forced exodus of people that we have seen in decades, possibly since the Second World War. More than 6 million people gone outside of Ukraine, millions and millions displaced inside the country. And this is first and foremost a humanitarian problem. And it has been responded to with great generosity outside the borders of Ukraine by European states that have taken in lots of refugees. And it has also been, we have tried to work with the Ukrainian government to meet the needs of those displaced inside the country. But those needs are monumental. And they're not just material needs, but they are also what we would call protection needs. Women and children are the majority of those who have fled outside the country. There is high risk of women being trafficked. There's many children that I wouldn't say are orphans, as has been said many times, but are separated from their families. So their situation needs a very careful examination before being taken care of. And the list of needs and responses is very long. But I would say that there are two issues related to this exodus that need to be kept in mind very, with a lot of attention. The first is that we believe that, by and large, this movement is temporary. Most of the families that have left are actually only parts of the family. The women, the children, some elderly people, some people with disabilities. In other words, people that are not fighting the war in Ukraine. And most of the people fleeing, especially the refugees, are telling us as soon as we can go back, we will go back. So I think it is very important that return begins being factored into the planning for the next steps in handling this crisis. We don't know what the political evolution is, but it is important to be ready for when people will say, we want to go back voluntarily to our homes, because that will be very intimately related. In fact, will become a major element in the reconstruction program, which will be the big challenge in Ukraine once, hopefully, peace comes back to the country. The other dimension that I would like to stress, there's many others, but the other one that I'd like to stress is that Europe, or let me be more specific, many European politicians have been telling us for now years and years that Europe is full, that it cannot take any more people coming, knocking at its door, either, poor people in search of opportunities, what we would call migrants, or people that we deal with fleeing war and persecution, discrimination, what we would call refugees. They're full, we have to push them back, build walls, the boats cannot land on our shores. Well, in the space of a few weeks, Europe has been able to take in 6 million, actually more than 6 million Ukrainian refugees. They have adopted a temporary protection directive, 20 years old, but they finally adopted it now. So that proves a point that Europe, if it works together with political will, it can exercise the solidarity that we have asked Europe to exercise for a long time for other refugees as well. I fully appreciate Ukrainians come from next door. Many have families and relations and communities. Many have skills, even some resources. So in a way, it's maybe easier to include or integrate them. But this does not exonerate us from having the same solidarity towards other people. This is a responsibility of the politicians to do that. So there is now a big precedent that we will invoke, and we hope that this Europe will build on this to have a better asylum policy and practice.
Thank you, Mr. Grandi. You have just mentioned that Europe has shown resolve and solidarity. So what remains to be done by the European Union and the international community as a whole to help refugees? Please.
I would say that the big challenge for European countries that have received refugees, until such time as that hospitality will be necessary, is to ensure that they have access to services and, where possible, and necessary to employment. This is a big challenge. But I was very struck. I remember I visited Poland I think it was the very beginning of March, a week after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Poland was already receiving hundreds of thousands of people. And the Prime Minister, the government told me, it's great that everybody's bringing relief supplies, blankets, food, medicines, that's fine. But what we really need to think about from the day one is including these people in our services. Kids have to go to school, people will be sick and we'll have to use our health systems. And then, we will give them cash, we are giving them cash, but that's not enough. They will have to have some revenue, some self-sustaining income. So access to the labor market, etc., etc. Now, I find it remarkable that Europe started thinking about inclusion so early in a refugee emergency. But this is unfinished work. And especially if refugees will stay for a protracted period of time, and it is possible, at least for some of them, it is important to accelerate that inclusion, because if we leave them excluded, then tensions will begin to rise. Then rejection will begin to be perceived. Then, unfortunately, some politicians will start exploiting that. So I think it's important that Europe continues. We are there to advise more than to help, because this is a European matter, but it's important to do that. The other point that I'd like to make is a more general point that, in the interest of what my organization does. This inclusion first is the most important thing that we should do in every crisis of refugees. Humanitarian relief is often vitally needed, but right at the same time, we should start talking about inclusion. This would diminish so much the perception that refugees are a burden, are a threat and a risk, because inclusion does exactly the opposite. It's good for them, but it's good also for the communities receiving them. Colombia, Uganda, there are countries that have done a lot in this area, and I hope that what Europe is doing now could be a further model for places where it is still more problematic.
Mr. Grandi, unfortunately, we have to conclude, but let me ask you if you have a final message to convey. This morning, I asked also Ambassador de Mistura what we can do in order to have all the other conflicts not to be forgotten, which is the real risk. So what's your view? What's your take on this?
Well, I am not only the head of UNHCR, I represent the United Nations, the one global organization. And my message is that, yes, there is enormous attention focused on Ukraine, also in the humanitarian area. And we understand why. The gravity of the crisis is such that it justifies this attention. However, it is very important that the UN and in general the international community does not forget all the other crises. Once the Ukraine war started, one of the first things I did after visiting the refugee countries was to go to Afghanistan. And then I went to Cameroon. I wanted to flag the importance of this crisis, the importance of keeping political attention towards resolution of this crisis and keeping the resources that are needed to respond both in the humanitarian and development field. Otherwise, we may solve Ukraine and we will be left with crises that meanwhile, also as an effect of Ukraine, have become worse and more difficult to resolve.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Grandi. Now, let me move to our second keynote speaker for this session, Ms. Carolina Sanchez-Paramo, is Global Director of Poverty of World Bank. Ms. Paramo, thank you very much for being with us today. So now we move to the other part, to the second topic, if you want, of this session, which is poverty and rising inequalities. And we know that, unfortunately, a food crisis could be just around the corner after the Ukraine war. So what can we do to avoid a scenario like this, and what the World Bank in particular, the organization, is doing to prevent this? Please.
Thank you, Antonio. It's really a pleasure to be here. And, like the previous speaker. I'm sorry that I couldn't join in person, but I just got a bit of of the last part of your previous discussion, and it's clear that you're having fascinating discussion there. As you said, we are indeed living through a very challenging moment. We had made significant progress in the fight against extreme poverty in the decades preceding COVID, but of course the pandemic has reversed that and has actually caused the first increase in extreme poverty that we've witnessed in over 2 decades. And this is likely to be further exacerbated, as you said, by the consequences of both the Ukraine conflict, which we were just talking about, and rising inflation around the world, particularly food inflation. We at the World Bank estimate that because of this compounding crisis, COVID, war, also climate change to some extent, we are likely to see 75 to 95 million additional people living in extreme poverty this year, 2022, compared to what our pre-pandemic projections were for this same year. Rising food prices are particularly devastating for the poor and the vulnerable. And in fact, we estimate that for each 1% rise in food prices, we could see up to 10 million more people living in extreme poverty. These are pretty large and dramatic numbers, particularly if you put them in the historical context. In addition, this spike in food prices could also worsen hunger, right? So it's not just about poverty, it's poverty that is really what we call deprivation, right? Families, kids going hungry. And we already know that hunger was an issue before the pandemic, and it was already alarmingly high in many parts of the world due to conflict in those areas, extreme weather, and pests. So I want to echo what we just heard, right? It's important that we don't forget that the world didn't just go into a crisis when the Ukraine conflict started, right? That there were many crises unfolding in many countries and in some cases across countries before this happened. In fact, more than half of the population in low-income countries are currently experiencing food shortages. And even in countries where food insecurity is low, price increases and disruptions to the supply chain are really tipping many people into extreme poverty. For example, the latest data that we have suggests that between January and April of this year, almost 90% of emerging market and developing economies experience food price inflation greater than 5%, with many experiencing double-digit inflation. We haven't seen anything like this since the financial crisis. And in 70% of the countries, food price inflation exceeded, and in many cases exceeded by a lot, overall inflation. And unfortunately, I think we all sense that this is likely the situation, that this is likely to continue for the next few months and potentially over a year. And this is why I think we really need to all make a call for countries and the development community at large, which I know it's represented in this conference, to take urgent action, to both lessen the impact of higher prices in the immediate term, but also just to ensure over the longer term that the poor and the vulnerable have access to food in a way that is more continuous and not disrupted when something happens in the international markets arena. So how do we do this? I want to put four ideas forward, and then I'll say a couple words on what the bank is doing specifically. First, we need to avoid measures such as trade restrictions, which can actually risk exacerbating price increases rather than mitigating the problem. Second, we need to strengthen social safety nets and provide well-targeted and cost-effective cash transfers to vulnerable households whenever that's possible, to help them cope with prices that are already high. Third, we need to facilitate farmers' access to financing. This won't have an impact immediately, but it will be critical to ensure that we don't have a similar problem when the next crop comes around. Because today we know that some of these farmers are struggling to buy fuel, fertilizer, seeds, all the inputs that they need to ensure that we will have a strong crop the next time around. And then finally, it's important that we start investing to transform food systems so that they are more productive, more resource efficient, and more resilient overall. So again, a mix of short-term and longer-term policies. So what are we doing at the World Bank? We are doing exactly that, engaging with countries on short-term measures and longer-term measures. As part of our sort of comprehensive response to this compounding crisis, we have made available up to 30 billion over the next 15 months in both existing and new projects. We are also mobilizing support through IDA, which is the World Bank's fund for the poorest countries. And specifically, we are really utilizing the IDA crisis response window, which offers $1 billion in early response financing to address acute food insecurity and disease outbreaks and prevent them from becoming full-blown crisis. So this is a window that is always available and of course has been heavily utilized over the last couple of years, as you can imagine. In fact, since the start of IDA 19 in July 2020, we have allocated over 530 million across 11 countries through this program. For example, in Yemen, we've allocated $50 million from the early response finance window to improve the availability of food and nutritious diets and enhance the overall country's capacity to respond to future food security crises. But much more needs to be done, there's no doubt. We are also working with countries, as I said, towards the longer term, trying to transform their food systems and to support a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery from this crisis. And then finally, the World Bank and the G7 presidency are sort of co-convening the Global Alliance for Food Security, which is an initiative that aims to facilitate the sharing of best practices and to catalyze an immediate and coordinated response to this crisis, something that was also pointed out earlier, this need for coordination. Let me stop there.
Yes, from your words, it's clear that the food crisis has an unfair impact because it's heavier on vulnerable groups. So my question is, in particular, what is the potential impact on refugees, which are very peculiar, vulnerable group, and how can we spur developed countries, rich countries into action? Please.
Absolutely. As I said earlier, the poor, the vulnerable are always the least able to cope with the consequences of crisis. And of course, displaced populations, refugees, are vulnerable within the vulnerable, right? So we do know that high food prices will hurt the poor and the vulnerable the most. So let me talk a little bit about that and then zoom into refugees. Poor families around the world typically spend about 2/3 of their income on food. While in a high-income country, and I think for many of us, this is probably true, a typical person spends much less, about 25%. So this means that when food prices increase, it has a much higher impact on the overall ability to consume other things for a poor family than a non-poor family. We also know that at times of crisis, and particularly at times of economic crisis, poor and vulnerable groups are likely to adopt coping strategies that could potentially result into food insecurity and damaging effects over the long term. For example, data from the Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement shows that access to food and food security were major concerns for forcibly displaced families even before the war in Ukraine. And the situation has only worsened since because of rising prices and the associated decline in incomes. For just a couple of examples from two countries so that you get a sense for the magnitude. In Bangladesh, 54% of refugee households reported buying either lower quality or cheaper food items just to cope. And 43% of these refugees reduce food portions or skip meals entirely. Similarly, in Chad, where food insecurity is a continuous challenge that predates COVID-19, but that got exacerbated, obviously, as a consequence of the crisis, nearly 87% of refugee households experienced severe food insecurity in early 2021. So here you have groups that are already vulnerable, already in difficult circumstances, resorting to consuming less food, in many cases not having food at all, or replacing more nutritious foods with foods that are less so just because they are cheaper. So yes, this food crisis can have a substantial impact on the lives of these groups, including, of course, as I said, the forcibly displaced. And I just want to highlight something that you said at the beginning in your introductory remarks to this session, and that's the fact that the population of forcibly displaced has more than doubled over the last decade alone, reaching over 100 million people globally. So we are truly living a crisis within a crisis here. So in this context, countries, both advanced and developing, need to adopt policies that effectively tackle the problem and stay away from policies that are counterproductive. Take trade restrictions, for example, which I already mentioned. Export curbs on food can amplify problems and lead to higher prices. They don't resolve the structural issues. And yet we see several countries having taken this kind of action over the last few months. We know, for example, that the bans on wheat exports imposed between the beginning of the war and May, so in just a period of a few months, impacted more than 1/5 of world trade, and were responsible for a 9 percentage point increase in world wheat prices. Think about the magnitude of that impact just coming from trade restrictions. Measures like this basically not only exacerbate the impact that this crisis is having on the vulnerable, but also could lead to a tit-for-tat escalation that could further pronounce the crisis. Countries should also refrain from putting in place price controls for food or energy, which has been shown again and again to be both ineffective and costly. And they should instead use cash transfers to compensate those that need it.
Okay.
And yet we know that there's a large number of countries that are doing exactly that, using subsidies instead of strengthening social assistance to address the crisis. As of April, 84 countries had announced a total of 221 programs, various programs, to respond to this crisis. Subsidies, including for fuel and food, accounted for 79% of the total response. So basically, they were the most popular measure used, despite the fact that we...
May I invite you to conclude, unfortunately, because we are running out of time. Sorry
yes, I'm just closing.
Thank you.
And similarly, in contrast, we see that social assistance only accounted for 17% of the response. Again, massive contrast. So to your question, just to close, advanced economies should implement the right policies at home and should support governments in low-income countries and middle-income countries in doing the same through, of course, financing and advice, but also through international cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We truly appreciate your contribution. So now I leave the floor to Maria Cuffaro for the panel discussion. Thank you again, Ms. Spram.
Well, welcome back, and I'm sorry, of course, that, it wasn't Paolo Magri, it was the old notes that I had, and soon you will see the real Paolo Magri, but first, let's come to this panel that was, of course, introduced wonderfully by Grandi for a UNCR. Let's keep on talking about, this is probably the biggest challenge that we do face. Refugees in an unfair world, that is the title, and it sums up rather neatly what the problem is, because as you heard before, for the very first time in 30 years, inequalities and poverty is rising in the world. And we heard 10 more million people are under poverty line. Those are not just numbers, those are people. So now we'll try to focus on how to avoid this vicious circle of poverty and instability, and of course, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine that accelerates these challenges and these problems. And so we'll try and focus how to reduce the gap between rich and poor, which is widening, especially in developing countries. And as you see on stage, I've been joined by Giovanni Fosti. Welcome, thank you for being with us. President of the Fondazione Cariplo. And online we are connected with Priyadarshi Dash from New Delhi, Associate Professor of RIS, Indian think tank, Delhi-based. Welcome, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Maria. Good evening.
Good evening. And we are also joined by Tetsushi Sonobe, Dean and CEO of the Asian Development Bank Institute. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Maria.
So I would start here with Dr. Fosti. You're president of the Fondazione Cariplo, which is one of Italy's main charitable foundations. And you do say that inequality concerns everyone, so even you. How can we help reduce these inequalities? And to this aim, what's the role, according to you, that education has?
Well, good afternoon, and let me say that it's an honor for me to be part of this panel, and I wish to thank ISPI, Bocconi, OECD and T20 Indonesia for hosting this forum. Well, I would start by saying that facts and figures are really clear. Inequalities are rising. In Italy, for example, according to Istat, between 2019 and 2021, the number of people living under absolute poverty increased by 1 million. But this is not happening only after the pandemic. It is taking place in the context of transition as the digital and the environmental ones. So this transition risks leaving part of our communities behind and to create fragmentation. So how can we deal with contrasting inequalities? I would like to say that this is, of course, a moral issue, but it is not only a moral issue. What I mean, contrasting inequalities, of course, is a matter of justice. It is morally unacceptable that our communities leave behind so many of their members. However, this is not all. There is also a sort of pragmatic reality. Inequalities hinder the development of our society. So we should also think about how inequalities are changing. Who is getting poorer? A growing type of inequality concerns the youth. Italian minors living in absolute poverty are more than 1.3 million, and the phenomenon of need is rampant. They form 20% of Italian youth between 15 and 24. So the reality makes it clear that reducing inequalities is not only about justice, it is about building the future of our country. And in a moment when we think of reconstruction after the pandemic, we can't imagine a future when 1 in 4 young people are inactive. So education is key to contrasting inequalities, and for us, this started by activating the resources of our communities in response to the learning loss caused by the lockdown. To contrast the digital divide created by online learning, we activated a social supply chain of refurbished devices. Then, in the tutoring online program with Bocconi University, maybe some of people participating in this program are here, Bocconi University, Bicocca, and Harvard University students supported younger students facing learning difficulties. Third point, contrasting inequalities is also about securing the future of democracy. Inequalities break social bonds and create fragmentation. Trust and community bonds are essential to democracy. They ensure people's participation and interest in democracy. This also means that to reduce inequalities, We need to build community bonds again, creating the social infrastructure that promote trust. For example, Fondazione Cariplo supported the third sector organization that were struggling to survive during lockdown in 2 editions of the Let's Go project. Thus, reducing inequalities is not only about supporting the vulnerable parts of our communities, but also finding the resources that our communities already have. This has to happen with our eyes pointed at the younger generations, which have been affected the most. We can't leave them behind and deprive them of the desire to build future.
Well, thank you. And you, as you mentioned in your speech, it is a moral question, the economical divide. A moral question calls for ethical answers from politics, but also from finance. And I wanted to ask Dr. Sonobe, now we have the Ukraine conflict and China's lockdown that has been slowing down Asia's economic growth as well. And how would you address these risks, and in particular the risk of financial stress in developing countries?
Okay, thank you, Maria. Thank you, ISPI. Good evening from Tokyo. It's an honor and a pleasure to participate in the Global Policy Forum. I'm so sorry that I cannot join you in person. So the war in Ukraine has caused the grain price hike and energy price hike, which pushed up inflation rates in the developed and emerging economies and threatened food security and energy security in developing countries. So equally problematic are the supply chain disruptions caused by the lockdowns of major cities in China. So many factories in many countries stopped. The supply chain disruptions, together with the fuel price hike and the food price hike, have aggravated the inflation, which in turn put pressure on FRB to raise US interest rate. And monetary tightening in the US and other advanced economies will further drive up the cost of debt and make international refinancing ever harder for the global south. The default of Sri Lanka and the crisis of Pakistan are known by the world, but similar problems are serious across the developing world. According to the IMF, the share of low-income countries that are at high risk or are already in debt distress has doubled since 2015, up from 30% to 60%. Not only low-income countries, but a growing number of middle-income countries are suffering from high debt service burdens. Debt to GDP ratios and the external debt service to government revenue ratios had been on the rise already prior to the COVID-19 crisis and have further increased considerably for the last 2 years. Such a situation is not only threatening economic recoveries, but it's also impeding much-needed investments in climate resilience and Agenda 2030. So to cope with protracted liquidity and insolvency problems, G20 has put in place the common framework for debt treatment to restructure and, if necessary, forgive debt in low-income countries. The major concern is that this common frame lacks a mechanism to incentivize private creditor involvement and suffers from some other weaknesses. So against this backdrop, the T7 Germany Task Force on Sustainable Economic Recovery, in which I participated as one of the 3 co-chairs, made some proposals, including the following. G7 should reform the IMF and the World Bank's debt sustainability analysis to fully include climate and sustainability risks and investment needs. G7 should create legal safeguards for debt restructurings and limiting opportunities for holdouts to derail negotiation processes and outcomes, and increase incentives for private creditor participation in reprofiling and restructuring respecting the principle of comparable treatment of creditors. The last point, besides, we think that World Bank and other multilateral investment banks could set up and export credit programs for developing countries whose terms of trade have deteriorated because of the war and sanctions. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, because you outlined the goals that have to be achieved. Now, let's go back to reality, and we go link up to Delhi, where, according to Forbes, the numbers of billionaires in Delhi has increased from 102 in 2020 to 166 in 2022, so in just 2 years. And according to the World Inequality Report, India is one of the most unequal countries. So probably it's a good example to ask you, how can India achieve the sustainable development of all of the Indians and close this widening income gap between the have-nots and the haves? Professor Dash.
Thank you, Maria, for this very interesting question. First of all, I'm sorry for this mess up with that in the beginning of the session. Before I get into the India story, let me spend half a minute on what is happening globally. From the very start of the development discourse in the 50s, when most of the countries were getting independence from their respective colonizers. So that time, the idea that predominated the thinking was some sort of welfare state. Then we experimented with various combinations of the public sector, private sector models. Then we had experimented some sort of development state model in East Asia, Singapore and other countries, where we were a bit of success to tell to the rest of the world. Then the whole story of market economy, that we need to give a big space to the private sector to contribute. And then we landed in market economy. Now, what has happened? Growth has coexisted with inequality and poverty in all these major paradigms shift in the economic development thinking. So what I'm telling you that at the time of independence, India inherited a significant level of poverty and deprivation. Then the mixed economy model, where government had an upper hand over designing the policies, paid back in terms of playing a level playing field, providing a level playing field to see the monitoring of the progress that is made. Now coming back to that, if India is so unequal, then how can India achieve sustainable development goals? Or sustainable development for that matter. If you see the policies in the last decade, there has been a significant stress on addressing vulnerability at the grassroots level, like energy, access to low-cost energy, providing relief from the indebtedness, so ease of living kind of things. In fact, the incumbent government in the last 8 years have given thrust on those dimensions exclusively, so that the access to affordable credit, access to energy, I don't want to name the names, like the scheme of Government of India, like Ujjwala scheme, and then addressing nutritional security. So all these are the sort of saving the disposable income that was being spent on health, on all sorts of addressing the vulnerabilities. So that incremental saving will help them to invest in education and health. So that is a radical shift in the focus. Earlier it was delivering the transfers from the government. There was leakages in between. Now through digital platforms.
I think we have... talking about digital platforms, you froze for a moment on screen.
So I'm saying that, so there is a lot of process innovation in terms of the government programs which aim at addressing the severe economic vulnerability they have. And there is a stress on job opportunity, creating job opportunities, not just depending on the public sector to create jobs, but also whatever jobs are created in the informal sector and self-employment opportunities. So these are some of the things that are happening in a nutshell. Time would not permit to get into the details, but in the subsequent question, I can tell you certain things which help India to sort of lift from a very bottom level to see that the progress is happening. So I'll stop here and get back to you the next question.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much also for, reminding us that, of course, the colonial burden is a huge burden that many Asian, African, and even in the Middle East, that got independence only past century, many late 1940s, like India 47, 1960s, Africa, so that is a huge burden that would be, well, would need probably hours of in-depth study and reflection. But now I want to come back to our guest, Dr. Fosti, because many panelists addressed the food crisis, that, also the Ukraine war will worsen and will become much, much more dramatic. And it will worsen global poverty, and of course inequalities will be on the rise, and populations will be hit that have nothing to do with Ukraine or Russia. I'm thinking about Asia and of Africa. How do you think that this may affect the work of charitable foundations like yours?
Well, I would say that there is no room for debate about the relevance of the food crisis. In the world, 193 million people experience acute food insecurity, but I feel that we also need to know that in Italy, during lockdown, many children were forced to miss the only guaranteed meal of the day in school canteens because of the lockdown. So, according to FAO, the main drivers of the global food crisis remain three, which are conflict, extreme weather, and economic shocks. What can charitable foundations do? I think that we can contribute to think about the future in times of crisis. So we need to put together emergency approaches and systemic solutions. For example, and we need to start from the local level. In the city of Milan, for example, we started within there is a well-established project which is the Food Waste Hub project by the city of Milan with Fondazione Calipros Rete QB, and it was also awarded by a prestigious Earthshot Prize. This will offer resources to expand and improve this project about food waste. Also, philanthropic foundation can offer, of course, a vision of the future. They can experiment long-term solutions to tackle the roots of the problem. Of course, food is a very complex issue, which creates a necessity to work in alliance with many actors. Foundation can help these actors to have a broader understanding of the food crisis and to work together. Third point, contrasting the effects of the food crisis must be part of contrasting inequalities. We should not forget that inequalities are correlated one to each other. We need to work to contrast food poverty together with contrasting all inequalities. This means investing into the futures. Into the future so that part of our communities are not so vulnerable in times of crisis. The key, again, is education. For example, access to healthy food also depends on food environments, the living spaces and the options they offer. Working on our cities can influence how people experience food poverty. So, in a time of crisis and emergency, foundations can contribute by experimenting, creating networks, and providing a vision of future so that solution can prevent this crisis in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much also because, inequalities, food crisis brings to inequalities and from experience, I mean, inequalities bring to social unrest, and in some ways, I mean, especially here in this city, in Milano, you have experienced it even recently. And of course, I mean, that is everyday life for many countries where social unrest stems from inequality. And it's even true from the US. But now let me go to Dr. Sanobe. So the world has become less and less equal, and unfortunately that is a fact, and the poor are the ones who suffer most. And in times of war, how to avoid that the world forgets the most vulnerable population?
Yeah, Maria, thank you very much. This is an excellent question. So all we know that extreme poverty reduced dramatically. So people living with less than 1.9 US dollars accounted for 40%, more than 40% of the world population in 1981, but only 10% in 2015. So after the outbreak of the pandemic, poverty increased again, and more recently further increased due to the food price hike, as Carolina clearly explained in the previous session. But the conclusion is the same. Extreme poverty has reduced dramatically compared with a few decades ago. And we know that huge reduction was driven in large part by the fast-growing economies of Asia, in particular China and India. So this is a common understanding among us, but many of us do not know, do not have precise knowledge about where extreme poverty remains. It's not necessarily concentrated in low-income countries. So actually many are living in middle-income countries. So very recently, in one of the webinars my institute organized, I heard from Professor Rohini Pandey of Yale University about her study of hidden extreme poverty in middle-income countries. So let me introduce her finding and argument. So decline of poverty in those countries rising into middle-income status does not mean that countries are on track to end extreme poverty and no longer need assistance. Actually, there are large masses of extreme poor people living in these newly, middle-income countries. In 1987, 9 out of 10 extreme poor people generally lived in low-income countries. But by 2015, only 4 out of 10 live in low-income countries, while the rest live in middle-income countries. Over half of them in India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Kenya, Yemen, South Africa, China, Pakistan, and Zambia. So Professor Pandey referred to these countries as high poverty middle-income countries. So based on the long recognition that middle-income countries are on track to end extreme poverty, so some advanced economies and the World Bank substantially increased their financing and aid for fragile states and the regions. And such redirection of global aid risks neglecting the hundreds of millions who may never escape poverty despite living in countries that are becoming relatively rich. So reducing or ending aid to high poverty middle-income countries would not be a problem if those countries could take care of their citizens. But these governments are often slow to redistribute income to the poor for two main reasons. So problems of capacity and problems of will. So capacity means the capacity for domestic resource mobilization, and which the multilateral investment banks like ADB have been working on. But problem of will is or must be or likely to be more difficult to solve. So Professor Rohini Pandey is now working on this problem. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. In fact, you mentioned that inequality, poverty is on the rise in middle-income countries, and that is surely true for India. So, Professor Daesh, what tools can you put in place to manage? I mean, poverty brings to migration, and at times also it can be very, very dramatic, like happened with the Rohingya population that is now in Bangladesh. So, what are the tools to manage migration more effectively than it has been now?
Maria, I think let us be very pragmatic in our approach. Besides leaving this distress migration caused due to war and other conflicts, political conflicts, the economic migration is obvious to happen. In an interconnected world where some pockets of prosperity giving more opportunities, it will happen. But your question is very right. How to manage that? The way countries becoming or thinking of the nationalistic orientation during Trump era, all these things, those could be self-defeating approach. For example, Indians working abroad, and then South Asian workers exploring Indian market for jobs. These are the hard facts that are happening. But more than that, within country, the internal migration is also quite...
We have got again a digital divide, I suppose. Professor, you are frozen. I don't know if we can manage to, well, suppose that was proof what happens with digital divide. It is really a divide. So I thank Professor Daesh, if you can hear me. I thank also Professor Sonobe and Dr. Fosti. Thank you very much. And now I leave the stage for the conclusions to Paolo Magri.
Let's conclude together.
Oh, together.
Okay, would you mind?
Well.
This is the end for us, the end of the Global Policy Forum, but it's also the beginning, I hope, the beginning for you, the first step towards a deep involvement for you in global issues and, inshallah, in international careers. Being the end for us, it's the time to thank those who, in the front line or in the backstage, made it possible. Our moderators, first of all.
I thank you to have it made possible. It was a great forum.
Maria is often with us, and she is one of the great moderators for ISPI and Bocconi in this event. So I want to thank, being the end for us, those who made it possible. Let me start from Bocconi University. Bocconi has been since last year our partner in designing this event, and I wish to thank the welcoming generosity of President Mario Monti, of the rector and the managing director. But with Maria, together, we wish to thank the people in the backstage who, as usual, are instrumental and crucial to make everything good, and we hope we made something good, Silvia Colombo and Laura De Valba. I wish to thank OECD, T20 Indonesia, and send to our friends in Indonesia our best wishes for what's going to be a difficult G20, we know.
Very difficult,
so
yes.
We send them our best wishes. And then, of course, I wish to thank my team, ISPI team. It's difficult to mention names when you represent all of them, but they will allow me to single out 3 names. Anthony Paolo Magri, now Anthony, the one you, Antonio Villafranca, you presented as me, but also Francesco Rocchetti and Alessia Casetta, the 3 teams who have been heavily involved in this. But being the beginning for you is the time of wishes. The decade that started in 2020, your decade, the decade in which you turn adult, looks weird. It reminds us of the 80s, the lost decade, in Latin America, década perdida, a decade in which there was a recession, inflation, dictatorships. And as we have discussed during these 2 days, the word crisis was probably the most mentioned. We have a health crisis, a security crisis, an economic crisis, a food crisis, an energy crisis, a humanitarian crisis. So, weird. But I don't want to conclude with bad words, sad words, and I will conclude stealing positive words Staffan de Mistura, Ambassador Staffan de Mistura, utilized today. Do not despair. You can and must do something. There are no reason, this is Staffan de Mistura, to give up. Try better, fail better, but don't give up your dreams and ambition for global solutions. We truly hope, and I'm glad Maria is joining me in these final remarks, that these 2 days were a useful, small contribution to you in your first steps in global affairs.
May I add just something? Since you called me on stage, I want to thank Paolo Magri and ISPI, because him and ISPI did something exceptional, talking about geopolitics, foreign affairs, which is difficult. He made it mainstream. Might seem something simple, but it's not. Because now if we can talk and know what is happening, it's also to people like him and to institutions like the Università Bocconi, where you are. And I want to thank you, because you are starting now to study, and you are privileged. Use that privilege that you have now. Keep up the hope that Paolo was saying. Keep up the hope that Staffan de Mistura was saying, because you'll need it, we'll need it, the world is going to need it. It's going to be difficult, complicated, always more so. And we talked about many different crises, as Paolo said. And then I want to, of course, thank everybody who backstage works, because in everything, if there is no backstage, nothing happens on stage. And thank you, and thanks to everybody who worked there. Thank you.